so I thought
Yeah, we didn't get agreement on that.
New York and nothing will move.
Good morning. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. I'm David Biet. I'm director of the Canada Institute here. It's a pleasure to have you here this morning. And I apologize for the elevators. The elevators in our section of the building still aren't working. And for those of you who came in not our door and had the grand tour of the Wilson Center, now you know how difficult the building is. The Wilson Center was founded in 1968 by an act of Congress. We are a nonpartisan. We don't promote any policy or legislation. The Canada Institute was founded about 7 years ago to look at issues of Canada and Canada-U.S. relations, and in Canada we bring an American voice to bilateral discussions. Eric Farnsworth, Vice President at the Council of the Americas, and I were talking a couple months ago about this issue, Afghanistan, and our mutual colleague Pamela Wellen. We thought this would be a good idea to put a program together on this, and then fortunately or unfortunately, events of the last 2 months, and particularly the last couple of weeks, have really made this more timely. But today's program, the way we envisioned it, was sort of to talk about Canada and Afghanistan, the role Afghanistan plays, and Canada and NATO, Afghanistan and NATO, and then looking larger. So, and it looks like it's going to work out that way. We're delighted to have Council of the Americas as a partner this morning. They've been great folks to work with, and we've done one thing with them before over there. We're doing this here, and I hope this is the second of many more partnerships. Eric Farnsworth at the end here will be today's moderator. I will jump in at the end and give a closing. I should also say that we're I'm not sure it's live webcast, but we're being taped for webcast, which should be up in a couple days. The issue has been important. People have asked about this, and it's a service we can provide. So please know that what you say will be preserved in for posterity. Also, if you have Blackberries or cell phones, when something comes in, it makes an noise, and it interrupts the communication and gives us some electronic interference. So if you can turn it off and you're not going to have physical withdrawal, please do so. Otherwise, we'll bear with it. So with that, I'll turn it over to Eric. Thank you all for coming on this sweaty Monday morning, and over to you.
Well, thank you very much, David. I very much appreciate your hosting us today and the opportunity to talk about some very important issues. Before we get into the topics, why don't we ask some of those folks who are sitting in the back to come on up. It seems like we're talking a little bit in church here, where everybody's sitting in the back pews. So come on up, and then we'll have some seats in the back for folks who might be able to come a little bit later, might be running late. But first of all, I really want to thank you, David, for your good partnership here. This is a very important topic. At the Woodrow Wilson Center, of course, we work with quite a lot on a number of issues, and it really is a service in the nation's interest. So we are delighted to be here today. On behalf of the Council of the Americas, I also want to welcome all of you today to what promises to be a very interesting and important discussion with our distinguished panelists on NATO's role in Afghanistan, and more specifically, Canada's role in Afghanistan. The Council of the Americas, which many of you probably know as a Western Hemisphere organization which does an awful lot of work with Latin America and the Caribbean, has also had a very long interest in Canada. And our work on Canada issues dates back to the mid-1970s. Of course, we were one of the first and most vocal proponents on behalf of the business community for the U.S.-Canada FTA, which obviously morphed into NAFTA, which we strongly believe in and strongly continue to support. In addition to those issues, we serve as a forum for discussion on key issues related to Canada. We've hosted a number of senior Canadian officials, both here in Washington and in New York and elsewhere through the hemisphere, as I know David and his colleagues have done as well here at Woodrow Wilson. And finally, in the realm of advertising for the Council of the Americas, we are the Co-Secretariat for the United States for the North American Competitiveness Council, which is an organization that's trilateral in nature, U.S., Canada, and Mexico, and which has been empowered to give specific recommendations to the three governments on improving North America competitiveness in this very important time as we see challenges from China and India. And of course, we were very active for the trilateral meeting in New Orleans, which just occurred several weeks ago. But here today, we're here to talk about Canada's role not in the Western Hemisphere per se, but actually in a different part of the world, specifically Afghanistan. And as all of you know, Canada has had troops in Afghanistan since the beginning of the NATO mission in early 2002. Today, Canadian troops in Afghanistan number around 2,500. Since 2005, Canadian troops have taken the lead in the southern province of Kandahar, often referred to as the Taliban heartland. This area of Afghanistan has seen some of the deadliest fighting, and Canadians have, I think, more than proven their merits and been more than up to the task. As the number of casualties has begun to rise, and there are about over 85 to date, Canadians have begun to debate how long their troops should remain in Afghanistan, which is the sign, I think, of a healthy democracy and a healthy democratic process, and what the mission of those troops should be. In response, in the fall of 2007, Prime Minister Harper called for an independent panel to study these questions and to make recommendations directly to him. The panel's report on the future role of Canada in Afghanistan was released in January of this year. It's public, and I believe that we could have copies for those of you who would like to see that. Following the recommendations of this independent panel, the Canadian government has recommitted its forces to Afghanistan through the year 2011 and reprioritized its engagement with an increased focus on development in Afghanistan and the training of Afghan security forces. We are actually delighted today to have one of those panelists with us to lead our conversation, or I should say to begin our conversation. Pamela Wallin, who was one of only, 5 commissioners to participate in this panel at the very most senior levels of the Canadian government, private sector, and NGO community. And she took part in a months-long process. She is also somebody who has a direct relationship both to the Canada Centre here at Woodrow Wilson and also to the Council of the Americas, where she serves as our senior advisor for Canadian affairs. So full disclosure, we know Pam very well. We like Pam very much, and we're quite delighted that she was able to fly in this morning for this opportunity. All of you, I believe, have the bios of the speakers available? Okay. So we're not going to go into the bios, but we would call those to your attention. We have a very impressive group of folks. We're going to start with Pam. We're going to go next to Joel, and then Tom, and then Charles Berry. So with that, let's get right into it. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please join me in welcoming Pamela Wallin?
We'll do a brief recap on the recap that Eric so aptly gave there, but just the context, particularly for Canada, with its very long and proud traditions, World War I, World War II, again in Korea. We morphed in the 50s and 60s for domestic political reasons largely into a country that was much more focused on peacekeeping efforts around the world. Lester Pearson, whose name you will know. Our problem, so easy to state, so hard to solve, is how to bring about a creative peace and a security which will have a strong foundation. And that is precisely what we were, all those many years later, asked to look at in Afghanistan and Canada's role there. We did, as a country, go into Afghanistan immediately following 9/11 as part of the American Operation Enduring Freedom, which still operates in Afghanistan, separate and apart from, but in cooperation with the NATO operation. In 2005, a Liberal Prime Minister committed troops and treasure to Afghanistan, and again last year, or the year before, a Conservative government recommitted our troops, and then began the debate, as Eric said, about how long we should stay, and we should stay under what circumstances, and what we should do. So that's where our commission came in and produced this report. We worked under a very short time frame by our own choice. We were appointed, we actually worked 3 months and 1 day, which included 2 weeks on the ground in Afghanistan. And we decided that the report should actually be what it is, without pictures, 39 pages, because we actually wanted somebody to read it. Not only those in government, because there are thousands of these sitting on shelves places, but we wanted people to read it. And just as an aside, in the first week after the release of this report, there were some 200,000 downloads from our site of this report in total, which says to me that people were starving for actual information and facts and answering that very basic question about why we were there. And I think that was part of our intent, which was to really lay out the case for why we were there. And very generally speaking, I think there was no question about the dire and extreme humanitarian need And I don't think there was much disagreement on the security issue, although there is some in Canada vis-a-vis the United States, where the focus on 2001 and what happened at the Pentagon and the trade towers didn't quite gel in the Canadian mind in the same way it gelled in the American mind. But there is a recognition that security is a profound issue. So under a UN-sanctioned, NATO-led mission where we were invited in by the duly elected government of Afghanistan and welcomed by the people, and where the humanitarian security needs was obvious. It was kind of, if Canada doesn't do this, then when will it do, and provide military and humanitarian services. So, and in the wake of that report, support for the mission, and I think we'll have some other numbers on this as well, but support for the mission did go up. And I think that was just purely a result of people understanding why we were there in the first place. The debate in Canada was really about whether or not we could be peacekeepers and other people could do the war fighting. And this is a debate that we've had in a lot of places around the world. And I think part of what we attempted to do here was educate that, particularly in a place like Afghanistan, where you're fighting in a not traditional warfare setting. There are no front lines, there are no black hats, there are no white hats. The enemy mingles with the civilian population. It's often difficult for those of us who are outsiders to tell the difference in terms of how they live within proximity. This is not a traditional war. This is insurgency and counterinsurgency. And so we needed to have some discussion about that, what that would mean. A lot of people in Canada believing that somehow we could go in and do the humanitarian side without doing the military side, despite the fact that a lot of the folks that were doing the humanitarian side said, look, we can't do this unless we've got a soldier beside us to get us from point A to point B. It is not safe enough for us to exit the safety of the compound. So then when a country starts to take casualties, and because the media was so constricted and restricted in its ability to cover this, the problem these days is that, and I was a journalist for 30 years, is that companies don't want to pay the insurance premiums to send their reporters in to cover these stories. So when they go in, they pretty much sit on the base, so that every story becomes the only story they can cover, which is a casualty. And so there is a report of a casualty, we hear that. There is confirmation of a casualty, we hear that. There is the departure ceremony for the lost soldier, we see that. There is the arrival ceremony for the lost soldier on the other side. There is the parade of every casualty became a 7-day story in the Canadian media, and there was no other discussion about the hundreds of millions of dollars that were being spent and the efforts that were being made by those very soldiers in separately and in conjunction with the humanitarian side. So that was part of our task also, to see what was going on the ground so that we might reflect this a little more accurately than what people were able to see. For example, going into the schools and seeing that they were functioning, going into some healthcare facilities, going into governance, different places where people were struggling with the formation of some form of democratic process, where we had been aiding and abetting that process. The problem is, and you will be familiar with this in the United States context as well, is that at home there had been a couple of political scandals which had resulted in very tough legislation referred to as accountability legislation, which was then superimposed on all our external spending around the world. So what we also discovered is that our aid dollars were being channeled through second and third parties, including the government of Afghanistan, but other aid organizations, and they were doing good things with it. It's just that it was there was no way for that to be properly represented to Canadians or to Afghans. So we were doing all of these things, but we were getting no credit for it in any way. So all of these things formed the basis of the of some of our reports. I think the most important educative role that we played was to try to explain to people that this is not warfare as they understand it. We are dealing with failed states. I know it's this year's buzzword, but there's no other way to describe it. We are not going into normal, if I can use that word, war-fighting situations. So dealing with failed states is going to be what we're all going to be dealing with over the next foreseeable future. That's going to be primarily the activities on the both military and humanitarian sides. So we have to understand what that means, what dealing with failed states means, and that their needs are different than the typical warfighting situation. And so we need to recalibrate what we do and how we look at this and how we work together on these issues. So that's part of what we try to get focused on as well. Our government about 2 weeks ago released its next response to us. Its first response to the committee was to strike with their partners a compromise which on all sides everyone agreed that our troops would stay till 2011, which just kind of got everybody through the current crisis so that there was no, this wasn't consuming everybody on a daily basis, making it very unfair, because we were certainly told on the other side when we got there is, hey, we can just sit around and wait it out. This is easy when you guys are busy in these little democratic discussions that you have. Again, we have to understand sometimes how these things are perceived. But one of our firm criticisms of governments in Canada was to focus our spending in those countries so that it can have greater effect rather than disperse spending. And I was really pleased that they came out, this one's called Charting a Course to 2011, where they've decided, for example, instead of just spending money on health care, that we are going to eradicate polio, focused. We are going to work on the Dalla Dam, focused, clean water. We are going to build and contribute to 50 schools and keep them open. Very focused rather than just saying education. And this is the kind of stuff, because you need benchmarks. I'm sure some of you are familiar with the name Ashraf Ghani, who was basically wrote the new Afghanistan governance structure and was its finance minister. He runs something now called the Organization for State Effectiveness. I'm not sure what the title is. But he is actually making the case about how important it is that we have metrics in this new world so that we can judge what victory looks like. On that point, let me be clear, and we tried to be clear in the document here too, that there will be no Victory Day parades either in Washington or Ottawa or in any other 24 capitals around the world where our troops all come home and, the confetti rises. Victory, a win for the West in this circumstance is, I think, at the very best, an intelligent exit strategy where we have left the Afghans prepared to do what it is that they want to do. And the bad news that we've seen in the last couple of weeks about sort of this little mini resurgence of the Taliban and the fact that their numbers, they seem to be able to amass in greater numbers than they have been. Our own Chief of Defense Staff, Rick Hillier, I think quite rightly pointed out that if you're looking for a silver lining in this bad news, and there's no question it's bad news, is that the Afghan troops led most of the operations. And a year ago, that simply would not have been the case. We went out to these forward operating bases, which are, holes in the sand, miles from nowhere where you're sitting ducks. There'd be half a dozen Canadians, half a dozen Afghans living in these places, and to see how they work together and how that transfer of skills, not just equipment and uniforms and all of those things that are important, but how that transference of skills was going on was really quite extraordinary. A little less successful in terms of the Afghan police, but that had more to do with the fact that you've got 26 different countries training them with 26 different mindsets about what a police officer is supposed to be. I'll just say a couple of things about which I've said publicly before, which is not about the report. My own personal concerns coming out of this have not to do just with domestic issues. I've laid out some of those and what I think our governments should be doing and how they should be responding and while the West in general tends to think that if we would just import our governance and structures, that everybody can live happily ever after. And we had Afghans quite politely say to us, you know, that's really was really good, and thank you very much, and we're really looking forward to the day that the women's group can meet every Tuesday night. But right now we're hungry and we have no clean water. And so could we just focus on Part A before we get to Part B? And so I think that has been an education for all of us. One of the things, though, and I'm coming back to my point after that small detour, is that I think we as a country, Canada, which is very dependent, in a sense we forfeit our sovereignty, our decision-making on these huge militaristic questions through the UN and through NATO. That's what we do. We wait in a lot of ways for the group to sign on before we sign on in general. And I think that multilateral approach is long been part of our history. It troubles me because of what I see, and again, these are personal comments, perhaps shared but not, I won't speak for them, by some of my colleagues about the state of NATO and the state of the UN in terms of effective decision-making bodies. The meeting with NATO with the four-star generals in Kabul in last October, November, and being told that we were getting right on top of that Afghan strategy really quickly, since this battle had been going on since 2001, was not heartening. And the dysfunctionality of the UN and its inability to make decisions quickly, too much internal politics. The authorship is more important than the substance of any proposal, and it makes it difficult for people to support things that should be done. And I think that we might at a later point want to look at how we deal with that. And I think one final point on our own country, which is when we went in 2005, there were those who said to us, "Are you ready and up for the task?" And I think psychologically and all of those things we really were. But what it did shine a light on is that we had been paring back our military over the course of the last 20 years in terms of spending, with this notion, again, naive more than ill-purposed, but this notion that if you're doing peacekeeping, somehow you don't need the equipment to do this. And so there's this nation of Boy Scouts up there with blue berets in hand running into war zones. So it did help us focus that question on the need for proper equipment. And we are starting to re-equip people. I think it was Churchill who said that every nation needs a military, either their own or someone else's. And we had been using someone else's for a while in terms of equipment, and still were. So when we went into Kandahar, which is the toughest part of a very tough neighborhood, a lot of our friends and allies said, "Are you sure you can do it?" Well, we did, with the help of the 30,000 Americans that were on the ground and the other NATO forces that were there, and we are now starting to properly re-equip and rearm. And to me, this was a fundamental issue, and if I went to Afghanistan for no other single purpose, it was the day that we were, as a panel, airlifted out of a very tense situation on a borrowed American Black Hawk. And on that same road, about 3 hours later, 2 young soldiers, Canadian soldiers, had their limbs blown off on a road that was peppered with IEDs. So sometimes these more basic things that we need to understand, while all of our generous Western approaches to help and encouragement is good, we have to remain focused on some of the basic jobs, because if you pave these roads, it's a little hard, or it's much harder to put an IED in. So I think that, some of these things that we learned on the ground have helped change the focus a little bit for our country and for our decision makers, and I mean that on all sides. I think no one wants Canada to be a spectator nation. It's not our own history, and I think we're a little tired of of acting a little bit like Blanche Dubois, in a streetcar named Desire, sort of dependent on the kindness of others. We have extraordinary troops, and watching their work on the ground up close and personal couldn't have, as a Canadian, made me more proud of the work that they are doing there and the risks that they are taking. As Eric says, they have indeed lost more than 80 colleagues, but they feel committed. And the Afghans, to the best of our ability, what we were told repeatedly from all levels that we met with, individuals, teachers, the tribal councils that were meeting, the governor's offices, all said essentially one thing, and I'm paraphrasing, which is, if you stay, we may not win, but if you go, we will most surely lose. And I think that's what, in the end, was our argument, that we had taken on this commitment, and it's something that we need to see through. So I'll leave it at that, and we can have questions.
Thank you very much, Pamela. And I'll tell you, that was a terrific way to set the table for our discussion. So thank you very much. And you put any number of comments onto the table, which I'd love to pursue. I'm going to push that off until after the full panel has spoken, but I hope all of you are equally as energized by that as I was, because I think that there's just so much there that we can further develop. With that in mind, let's go to Dr. Joel Sokolsky of Canada's Royal Military College. He's going to talk a little bit on how Canada's engagement in Afghanistan has impacted Canadian public opinion, in particular how it's affecting Canada's view of civil-military relations. So, Dr. Sokolsky.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the invitation to be here this morning. Well, if someone had been in Canada in the late 1990s and witnessed particularly the criticism of the Canadian government, some of it coming from NATO itself about Canada being a laggard within NATO and not fulfilling its obligations, and then fast forward to the Manley Committee report and Parliament, where Canada now becomes the scolder of NATO, that NATO is not doing enough. You wondered if you were in the same country, let alone the same universe. So there's been a major change in terms of how Canada is perceived, and this all has to do, as Pamela said, with the Canadian role in Afghanistan. So what I'd like to do is talk a little about that change, about civil-military relations and its impact, domestic opinion, the future, whether this will continue, and then bring it back to attitudes towards NATO in Canada. First of all, I think it's important that it's, I think, quite right that Canada was known as a peacekeeping nation. It's certainly an image that was cultivated assiduously by various governments, but for most of the Cold War, it was containment and deterrence and NATO that drove defense spending. Canada acquired weapons, deployed forces, joined alliances, primarily in service of Cold War objectives. This included a major military buildup in the early 50s and various buildups when NATO called. Now, it is true that for most of this period, Canadian governments tried to limit defense spending. But generally, in terms of the Canadian forces, their view of themselves was always that they were warriors, that they were in Cold War service, and that peacekeeping, in fact, for most of the Cold War, did not drive defense spending and involved relatively little overall expenditures, even into the 1980s and early 90s, when new weapon systems were acquired, such as the new frigates, the light armored vehicles. They was primarily for a NATO role. And, of course, Canada was heavily involved in atomic deterrence and containment through NORAD. This is not always the view the Canadian government gave to the Canadian people, but this is what drove defense spending. Even into the 1990s, when the Cold War ended, and it seemed to be in the early part of that decade, a peacekeeping renaissance, Canada quickly found itself in very dangerous environments in the Balkans. By the end of the 90s, there were as many Canadian troops in the Balkans had there been in Germany when the Cold War ended. The problem in the 1990s was that the government was cutting back on defense spending as it was cutting back on all other spending. You may recall that in the early 90s, Canada's deficit and fiscal situation was in dire straits, with the Wall Street Journal suggesting that Canada was about to slip into third world status. So the government cut back, but expanded commitments. And this period came to be known, in General Hillier's phrase, as the Dark Decade, when funds were cut, but commitments were expanded. Nevertheless, in the 1990s, Canadians got used to sending their forces overseas to deal with internal struggles, whether it was the Balkans, whether it was Somalia, whether it was East Timor, whether it was Haiti. So the deployment to Afghanistan, although it's seen as a major break, in fact was not. Canadians had been going overseas for nearly a decade to areas which were not major concerns or vital interest to Canadian security. The difference would be that in Afghanistan, the deployment would be backed up. First of all, it was in the context of a major U.S. global war on terrorism, so it suddenly became a vital interest, whereas one could say that the Balkans, Haiti, East Timor were not. And in fact, the military were given more of the tools that they needed for this deployment. So, and in fact, this was a long Canadian tradition. The Canadian strategic culture is one of expeditionary forces. Going back to the Boer War, the First World War, we go overseas and we serve in allied coalitions, sometimes with controversy, sometimes not. It's also the case that this narrative of the 1990s was reinforced after 9/11 with what was seen, the perception of the less than stellar support of the Chrétien government in the global war on terrorism, despite the fact that Canada had moved quickly on border issues, that it had deployed a major task force to Afghanistan in late 2001 and has been there since. But the perception of Canada as a laggard was then reinforced by the governments, by what was seen in the United States as a very confusing approach to the U.S. decision on Iraq, which is then reinforced by the Martin decision on ballistic missile defense. So there was a general perception that Canada needed to do more. And in the review of foreign policy that came out in 2005, the International Policy Statement, which was heavily influenced by General Hillier and others, Canada focused on failed and fragile states as a major threat to Canadian security, and this was going to drive not only foreign policy, but it was certainly going to drive defense spending, and that this is what Canada was doing. Now, overall, one hears about a Canada First defense policy and so forth, and there was a lot of emphasis on homeland security, but certainly when you look at the IPS, this is a long continuation of a Canadian commitment. The problem was, as the military had pointed out, if you're going to do this, you can't do this on the defense spending that had been going on in the 1990s. Although by the end of the 90s, defense spending had started to go up, and major equipment had been acquired. So one of the first things that made this possible, I would argue, was a shift in the balance in civil-military relations in Canada. For various reasons, the senior military, led by General Hillier and supported by first Prime Minister Martin and then Prime Minister Harper, seemed to have a larger footprint in Ottawa in order to have a larger footprint in Afghanistan. A shift in terms of the influence, and this was backed by what was then, I think, and still a popular opinion, certainly voiced by journals such as the Globe and Mail, the Canadian Defence Association, and most academics, that Canada indeed had become a laggard and needed to spend more on defence, and this required a shift in focus. And so beginning, I think, after 9/11, particularly with the Martin government and then the Harper government, you had pledges to increase defense spending. And more importantly, the Canadian senior military began acting a little like the American brethren. They began speaking openly and in terms not only recommending policies but insisting and speaking to the public, directly to the public, in a way that we had not seen for a long time in Canada. And I think, as one of my colleagues puts it, General Hillier seized the microphone on this issue and framed the debate for Canadians about what was going on. He raised the stature of the armed forces, You often heard that, we're probably the only military academy in the world where the standard text is a military history of an unmilitary people. But that's not true. Canadians are not militaristic, but when called to the colors, they do respond. And General Hillier touched this pride that Canadians had in their operation and connected Canadians not to the policy, but to the individual soldier who was out there. And this has been a remarkable transformation in Canadian political culture in the space of a few years. Pamela talked about when the casualties come home, they come home to Trenton Air Base, and along that highway over 120 kilometers to Toronto, people were standing on bridges. And we hadn't seen this for a while. And this is what I think shifted the debate in Canada, putting a human face on it. In addition, it was clear that General Hillier had articulated for the public what the stakes were. Canada was threatened, as the West was, by terrorists. Afghanistan had for various reasons had provided sanctuary, and it was in Canada's national security interest to do this. That it had to be a 3D approach, as the government put in the IPS. It was diplomacy, and it was defense, and it was development. So for the first time, interestingly enough, coming out of the military, you had an articulation of what appeared to be a coherent approach in which Afghanistan. And the bonus here was that this appeared to then meet much of the criticism, justified or not, real or not, that had been coming out of the United States about Canada's support for the global war on terrorism. A major public relations effort was that Canada was not a terrorist haven, that it was stepping up. And so part of what the explanation of, I think, we had is that, ironically, the military at this moment comes to the government with a coherent policy which which gives the government what it needs. Certainly the Martin government and the Harper government, and frames the debate. Now, in doing this, of course, there were the government, and this is where I'm shifting domestic public opinion. The government certainly now was faced with a situation where the military was popular. The chief of the defense staff was popular, not surprisingly more popular than anybody in the government, and the armed forces were very popular. But the policy itself, it became difficult. And as we've heard here, was the government explaining the policy right? Was it communicating with Canadians in terms of what was going on? And the polling indicates that still the public is ambivalent about the policy. There is high support. For example, 43% in a recent poll to provide aid and development to Afghanistan, but in one poll, only 4% to engage the Taliban in counterinsurgency strategy. A large portion of Canadians support the multilateral effort and understand that it's in the context of NATO, yet at the same time, a 2007 poll said that 44% of Canadians believe that Afghanistan was important because of pressure from the United States. So what I'm suggesting here is that we haven't had a breakthrough in public opinion on this issue, in part because the issues are, the public is ambivalent because the issues are ambiguous. Are we there to deal with failed and fragile states? Good idea. Then how come we're not in Darfur? According to Stein and Lang in their recent book, General Hillier had assured Prime Minister Martin that he could do all this and go to Afghanistan, and it turns out that you can't. Not at that level, not if we're going to get away. And this is where I think Hillier focused the government, says we're not going to penny packet out Canadian forces anymore. Have things like Operation Solitaire, where we send out one person or 3 people here. We're going to focus where we make a difference. But in order to do that, and this is where public opinion comes in, there are things you can't do. And there was some criticism, and there is in Canadian opinion, that not only have we veered away from the peacekeeping role, but if we're really interested in failed and failing fragile states, if we're interested in development, why are we only focusing on one? The answer from the military is perhaps we can't. The argument that we hear is that, of course, the government needs to explain it. And I think to a certain extent it's tried to do this, but in the Canadian context, we've rarely had an event which has had so much explanation and so much content. Moreover, as the military and the government have understood that they're not the only voice out there. Canadians are being bombarded by information from the Senless Council, which talks about the opium. Every time an American scholar runs an article, it's front page news in Canada and seems to question. So we've had a great parliamentary debate. We've had a solution in Parliament which talks about extending to 2011, but with re-emphasizing the role. But I would argue there's been no breakthrough in terms of public opinion in Canada on this, although there is great support for the troops. There would be great support for stabilizing Afghanistan and bringing aid there. And I think in this sense, the country. The government has done as good a job as it can, given the ambiguity of the situation. Needless to say, also public opinion in Canada has been affected by other allied public opinions by the Bush factor. The worst thing you can say about Afghanistan is that it connected with the Bush administration, regardless of what the United States, how well the United States is doing there. Another down the road problem, which has now been in discussion. And it will be a subject of a study by the new Parliamentary Budget Office. And this raises the issue of what the downstream costs of this mission are. As we've heard, Canadian defense spending is going to increase. It's going to nearly double in the next decade or so. But there are questions about, even with that, whether Canada can sustain another one of these missions quickly. Unlike in the Cold War, where Canada bought equipment and expected not to use it, so you would keep it around for many years, and the life cycle you had a large life cycle. Canada is now in the position where it's actually consuming its military equipment. Many light armored vehicles have been damaged or destroyed. They will need to be replaced. The government has acquired the C-17. It's acquired more Hercules aircraft, but in fact, there are concerns that the downstream costs of this deployment have yet to be accounted for, but the new Parliamentary Budget Office is going to look at. There are costs having to do with the care for the injured military and their families, and for providing annuity to those who have been killed, for providing continued medical care for those who suffer from post-traumatic stress syndrome, and this would fall on Veterans Affairs. So, in terms of what this means for the future of Canada pursuing a policy which will involve active involvement overseas, that's something which I think the government is going to have to look at, and even the increases in defense expenditure, some of which will be consumed by, for example, the new Arctic patrol vessels and other matters dealing with domestic security. Again, this is an issue which will affect, I think, public perception. The public, I think, has been comfortable with the increase in defense spending, largely because the economy is doing so well. If the economy should take a downturn, it's not clear that the sorts of increases required to maintain an active overseas role will be there. It's the same as in terms of the United States. But generally, surprising to those who criticize in Canada, the public tolerance for higher defense spending is quite high. But that's, I think, in part because Canada has experienced a very good economic growth in the last few years. It turns out we can have our social programs and defense spending, which in fact, when you think about it, it's still not moving much over 1.2% of GDP, the same it was when we were accused of being NATO's laggard. It's just that there's more money to go around. Recruitment. The number in the armed forces has not gone up dramatically, and we're also having people departing. And one of the problems is the people departing are those who we need, particularly non-commissioned officers. Finally, what does this mean in terms of Canada's support for NATO. In Afghanistan. Well, as I suggested at the beginning, we're in an unusual situation where it's Canada now which is chastising its allies for not doing enough in Afghanistan, but not all its allies. Of course, the United States, United Kingdom, and the Netherlands have been coming forward for Canada. This is a familiar grouping that we've seen before. The government can argue that this is an important litmus test for NATO, and it may well be. But if it is, then the Canadian public would wonder why it is that Canada has to threaten its allies in terms of coming forward. I think in general there is also the view that we were told that if we were prepared to put more treasure and lives on the line, Canada would exercise more influence within NATO. If that's the case, then the question is why hasn't NATO been more, other than the U.S. and the U.K., why hasn't NATO been more forthcoming in terms of its supports? Now, I think most Canadians don't realize how much support may actually be given there. But one of the arguments that was made in favor of a greater commitment was that if you're not willing to put up and take the risk, then you have no influence. My concern is that if this doesn't work out, one of the argument that had traditionally been given, that if you increase defense spending, you're going to be able to have influence in NATO. We did. We increased the risk. We took the lead. But does Canada still exercise any more influence in the alliance than it did before? Certainly, if NATO is one of those things that seems to go on and on regardless. There are other reasons to be in NATO, and Canada was active in the 1990s. But it was a major pillar of Canadian defense policy in the Cold War and after. And it would be in Canada's national security interest for NATO to pass this litmus test in Afghanistan. And hopefully that Canada will be able to contribute to that, although it will present the government with a difficult situation if the alliance isn't able to arrange support and at least to leave Afghanistan in a better place than it was. Hopefully Canada will be able to do that. It has a great stake in NATO, and I think it's indicated that its contributions, that no one now need question Canada's commitment to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Thank you.
Thank you. Very nice, and I think it leads very well into our next panelist, who is an active duty military officer with the United States. Colonel Tom Lynch has actually served in Afghanistan. He's had boots on the ground, I believe the term of art may be. So he's going to discuss the evaluation of NATO's mission and NATO's forces in Afghanistan more broadly, not with a specific focus on Canada per se. But one bit of full disclosure, I've actually known Tom for 20 years, since we entered together in the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton in 1988. We're dating ourselves. He's a little bit older than me, I'm happy to say. But the fact is, Tom is a good and close personal friend and somebody whose career I've watched with admiration as he continues to knock down some very, very impressive milestones. He'll be commanding U.S. military forces in NATO before all this is said and done. I'm fully convinced, Tom. But with that, let's turn it over to you, and thanks for being here this morning.
Eric, thanks. And thanks to David for having me here this morning, and the Wilson Center and the Council of the Americas. And thanks for that overstatement of my modest capabilities and possibilities. I think that the general consensus right now is that I probably reached my natural level of incompetence in military things, which is why I've been given the opportunity to spend a year at the Brookings Institution to try to develop, say, perhaps some other talents and skills. For those of you here to see my colleague for the year, Michael O'Hanlon, over at the Brookings Institution, let me tell you that I apologize for putting you through your Senator Lloyd Benson moment, because many of you, I'm sure, have seen Mike O'Hanlon no Michael O'Hanlon and know that I'm no Michael O'Hanlon. And I would confess to all of those things, even though he and I are down the hall from each other at the Brookings Institution, share a common educational background, and are great friends. Mike is absolutely irreplaceable. And there's no way I could rise to his standard of eloquence or analytical skill. What I'd like to do, therefore, today is tapping on what Eric has just mentioned, my time in and around Afghanistan, starting in early 2004, working as a military special assistant for the then U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan, continuing during my time in the United States CENTCOM when I was a strategic advisor and director of the initiatives group for General John Abizaid, and spent a lot of time into and out of Afghanistan. And then, having spent 2005 through 2007, posted in the country of Qatar, but going into and out of Afghanistan in support role a lot. What I thought I'd offer you this morning here is, based upon those experiences, a sensing in three areas, with perhaps a bit of a wider aperture than just Canada itself, but hopefully of some assistance in framing the issue. The first is NATO ISAF expansion, which has been alluded to here, and of course with which the excellent report that was done by Pamela and her colleagues got to. And indeed, there was a logic, albeit a conspicuous and somewhat curious logic, followed in 2004 and 2005 that led to NATO expansion, which produced the change of Canada's mission, particularly from one that was in the confines of Kabul, in the surrounding area of Kabul, where I saw them in 2004 through 2006, then down to the area of Kandahar. And indeed, there were, as I'll talk to you in a couple of seconds, some assumptions that underpin that have proven to be far less than sanguine when they were made, and therefore put us in a situation in that part of the world that we're having to work forward from now. Second, what I thought I'd offer is kind of a conception of, given that framework and the kind of where we are in the wider perspective of NATO and the alliance in Afghanistan, how is it that we play not to lose? And I would argue to you that in the short to midterm, that really is what the frame of reference needs to be within Afghanistan. And then I'll end on the point of what I would call the longer war, playing to win. Because without scaring or trying to metastasize something that has a time horizon right now on a year-to-year basis, or thankfully from the report from Canada on a to 2011 basis, well, I think one can make a good argument that 2011 might be a nice inflection point from which we can look at doing more things that are peace-oriented. There's a longer-term issue here that is really about South Asia security and the wider issue of jihadism and the threat to the West that is jihadism that I think we've got to talk through here to put the context in place. Let me try to briefly hit those three areas and then look forward to taking questions and interacting with the rest of the panel. First, NATO ISAF mission expansion. Indeed, starting in around 2004 late and going into early 2005, there were a series of assumptions made for all the right and pure reasons by those who were involved, not only in NATO ISAF, but the government of Afghanistan, and clearly our government, the United States government, that had to do with about what the future was going to look like in what had been referred to as the quadrants of Afghanistan. And indeed, there was a four-quadrant type of mantra that had developed in 2003, 2004, where you basically had the lower number quadrants, 1 and 2 in the north and the east, perceived to be much more peaceful, much more stable, and more about development and the expansion of good governance and the end of corruption and bad economies. And there is where the initial expansion of NATO with the Germans and some Brits and others had really taken place in early 2004 as kind of a feeler. Then you had the further south, and the perception down there was that basically, one, the steam was coming out of the Taliban insurgency. That even though there were still between 11 and 15 million ethnic Pashtuns in south and eastern Afghanistan who were almost indistinguishable from their cousins in Pakistan on the other side of the border in the western frontier areas, somewhere between 5 and 8 million of them, based upon how you judge the refugee flows or the intertribal tracking back and forth, that basically the Taliban insurgency had not shown much legs in 2004-05. And therefore, Quadrant 3 down around Kandahar seemed pretty darn ripe for expansion of NATO's mission. One, to help draw down U.S. forces. And admittedly, and I think we all have to admit this, there was a earnest desire on the part of the United States to cut back somewhere, and Iraq wasn't looking too good in 2004-05. Okay? And so Afghanistan looked pretty good for that. And so one could argue, and I think persuasively, that there was an oversell on the degree to which stability ops, peacekeeping, and other things where not just Canada, but large portions of NATO had great experience that we should filter and have them flow in there. And quickly, and some would say too quickly, the discussion morphed then into, well, how do you even do better on, say, standing down some of the Operation Enduring Freedom structure, which the U.S. had direct and critical oversight of, and get more of a NATO footprint and oversight, even to and including Quadrant 4, which is the east and the most difficult portion area for the insurgency, where the biggest part of the counterinsurgency fight had been taking place. How do you get more of a international flavor on that? And the answer became, well, even though U.S. forces may remain there for an extended period, what we want to try to do is transition and put NATO's rubric over the top of all that. In 2004, 2005, there were a lot of indicators if one just looked, say, perhaps at kinetic battle results against the Taliban and the other associated Salafi extremist movements, like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar's HIG, or Sulaiman Haqqani's insurgent group in the more center portion from the Waziristans across the border. The kinetics were all looking bad for the insurgents. Okay? Every time there was an engagement, you would see large numbers of losses, even if you did what we call the Afghan discount while I was there. That is, anything reported out of the Afghan circles, you tended to knock at least 1-0 off the back side of that and then look 50% in either direction to figure out what the truth was. You know, there was a lot of focus on that, and focus that, unfortunately, and as counterinsurgency experts have reminded us a lot recently, does not really get to the essential dynamic of what it is that drives the insurgency. And in this case, the insurgency, essentially the Taliban insurgency, but very tightly linked and interwoven with the global Salafi jihadi insurgency, looking for safe haven and a place to expand to, where Afghanistan and Western Pakistan are the mythical places where they like safe haven because they have great experience there, that those dynamics were not, in fact, categorically going in the right direction. And indeed, by looking at Afghanistan numbers and quantities, you know, we kind of missed the wider dynamic, not altogether because we were ignorant, but because we weren't getting very good picture on the wider dynamic out of Pakistan as to where the strength of the insurgency was in Pakistan. And as we now know, the strength is still there. It shows itself over and over. It doesn't need to show itself with great military victories in South or East Afghanistan. It just needs to show itself as having an enduring and a recurring presence, just like the strikes of last week do, which takes 11.5 to 15 million Pashtuns and says, hey, we aren't gone. We're still going to be able to come back. And if you throw your lot in too much with the Americans, the Canadians, the Dutch, or the Brits, you and your grandchildren can suffer from us when we're back here and they go away. Okay? And so I tag out on that point because I want to come then to mid to long term and say this really is an issue of persistence and staying power on the part of the wider alliance. And that goes in spades for America. And so as everybody's kind of looking for exit strategies, I think it's refreshing that Canada and the panel that Pamela has been involved in has at least talked about a horizon that goes out longer than just the short term. Because that's very critical in the dynamic of defeating an insurgency, is that those who are trying to help and empower the legitimate governance not be seen as just accidental tourists, finding a way at all costs to get out the back door as quickly as possible. And that those that are there helping the legitimate government are not afraid to do what needs to be done, which is not always kinetics and killing. Matter of fact, as has been said, and I think Rick Hillier has said this as well, who, by the way, I had the great pleasure of working with as a three-star over there and thought he was every bit as lucid and detailed as he's obviously been in his position as Chief of Defense Staff about how to deal with this. But 80% of this is about reconstruction, development, and getting good governance. But there's that 20% that is indispensable, okay, when those that come around that want to upset all that, drive off international aid agencies, get rid of any semblance of decent governance or good policing, want to have their way. And so you've got to be prepared to do that. And that test is going to continue, I think, at least through the midterm. So, what about the short to the midterm? And as I mentioned earlier, I think the mantra here, although it may sound defeatist, it's not intended to be, and bear with me here for a second on this, is to play, not to lose. And I say that because Afghanistan, again, is only part of the wider mosaic of jihadism and the threat that that poses to inimical Western interests, which are, by the way, how we kind of got here in the first place, okay? Development is part of the challenge, but it's not the first order condition. The first order condition is to stop the development and the metastasization of safe havens, where those that have a global terrorist agenda can freely plan, plot, and integrate their wishes, and then send out through a very robust transportation network those who would execute those wishes. And so what do I mean by playing not to lose? Well, first of all, we need to help in all the different ways that have been discussed here by Joel and Pamela, the Afghanistan government move itself forward from the 19th century into the 21st century. As we are seeing, that takes time. And it's fighting against a lot of background, culture, and traditions that aren't going to change overnight, but that in general, I think, in my personal experience, I hope would still be borne out, is being undertaken by people who genuinely want to move forward as Afghans, okay? And so there is a goodwill and a good faith that I think one can believe is present on the Afghan side going forward. But how do we help that as part of, the military context, the NATO context, as you will, if moving forward? Well, first, it's important to understand that NATO's presence there is really critical. It does send a wider message, so long as it's couched in terms of staying until stability is enhanced and the wider jihadi threat is eliminated. And that focus means an awful lot to those who are watching, quite frankly, because many Afghans, one just has to acknowledge, many Afghans are not quite so sure if this transition to NATO as overseeing the military alliance isn't just about the Americans backing out, handing it over to their cousin, and then their cousin's going to back out right after that, and then everybody's backing out the door. An act which, by the way, Pakistanis and Afghans have seen at least 2 other times since 1950, okay? And so you got to realize that perception is important here. So kind of the commitment, and you can never say enough about wanting to stay, and then backing it up with resources is very important here in the short term. Second is to acknowledge the importance of those contributing forces that can do as much as they possibly can within the NATO framework into the area known as counterinsurgency. And that is being able to provide the kinetic force as well as the stabilizing and peacekeeping operations, and helping to enhance the Afghan forces, as Pamela mentioned, the National Army, and now more and more so the National Police, which are far behind the National Army in development, in developing their own capabilities and commitments with a responsible, mature, and modern approach to doing their business. And I say that because any of you that have been to Afghanistan or seen the way policing is done in Afghanistan can see it more as a shakedown operation in a lot of places and a local ability to line pockets than really a firm presence on trying to shape and do policing. And so that's got to change, and with help and assistance. And so the alliance needs to do that. Next, the alliance itself, in addition to having the commitment, which fortunately I think we see continuing, although not without great consternation in many different nations, must look at trying to harmonize and rationalize where it puts its military strengths. And here, there's no doubt about it. The Canadians, the Dutch, and to a lesser extent the Brits have been put in a very challenging circumstance down in Kandahar, Helmand, Uruzgan province, because there is the heart of the Taliban insurgency. There is where it's been. It's its home ground. The Taliban are going to come back every year until the issue of sanctuary and safe haven in Pakistan is effectively dealt with, which it has not been. More about that to follow in a couple of seconds. And to the extent that those capabilities can be enhanced, and we can have that discussion and question and answer if you want, but everything from the lift that Pamela talked about, which is very important to covering these vast territories and getting quickly to an insurgent gathering that needs to be broken up or needs to be contested. And you can't do that when you don't have the helicopter lifts. Even if you have the helicopter, if you're on some type of a national caveat that says you can't fly any more than a certain number of blade hours a month, then you can't get there to do what has to be done. And all the ground transportation in the world isn't going to make that happen for you. So those are some things that the alliance needs to continue to work through. And if it's not right now in the South, then the American government, as well as the other NATO governments, need to ask the question of whether or not, like is being done right now with U.S. Marines, it might not be important for the U.S., as painful as it is, to provide that particular comparative advantage strength in its military forces to get down and make that happen. And I can only emphasize and leave open for further questions later on that Pamela's comments about rationalization of economic aid to assist the counterinsurgency that the military is conducting is really a severe challenge in Afghanistan right now. And here NATO, through really no fault of its own, has not been a positive assistance in this area, because NATO itself does not have any organic economic and political wherewithal, and therefore there has been an unintended but certainly very powerful fragmentation of the economic relationships going through the PRTs and the other ways in which money is flowed that doesn't necessarily enhance the on-the-ground reconstruction, short-term development, and expansion of credible governance that is very powerfully important as an antidote to the insurgents that are on the ground. So if that's what it means in the short term, the next 2 to 3 years not to lose, which, by the way, is going to require a very significant military footprint. And Canada's 2,400 to 2,500 forces here are vital in this process. Whether they remain in Kandahar in the current arrangements for command and control, an altered set of command and control arrangements, which I believe NATO is discussing right now, or even be focused in some other area, that's going to be vital that that at least be sustained through 2011. And the same is true for all the other allies at or beyond what they're providing there. One, to send the message rhetorically, but two, also to provide the human capital that's necessary to dealing with what's going on there right now. And I certainly don't exclude my own country from this process. We need to look at having a more robust presence in Afghanistan, and the Marines that are there in the South right now are a minimalist approach to what needs to have more of a robust presence, I would argue, going forward for at least the next couple of years. So finally then, what does it mean in terms of playing to win and widening the aperture to South Asia as a whole? Well, let me just offer a couple of names and a couple of comments. And the names I'd offer you here are the following. Asid Somner and Richard Ralph. Okay? And I offer those names to you in terms of two aircraft numbers. Air Canada 849, London Heathrow to Toronto, planned flights in 2006, and Air Canada 865, London Heathrow to Montreal. Okay? Sumner and Ralph, okay, both UK citizens of Pakistani background, are currently going through the British court system as two of the failed would-be liquid gel bombers. And I have just named for you two of the dozen planes that their indictments read they were planning to bomb somewhere in August 2006. Other listed aircraft, of course, include American, British, and other Western targets. I mention them because the two of them have had suicide tapes rounded up, both of which were clearly recorded in or with assistance of locations within Western Pakistan. And I'd add one name to that, and that name is Mohammed Beg. Mohammed is a second-generation Turkish Muslim who lives in Germany, and whose suicide video with a caption by Sulavin Hokmani was released about 3 weeks ago. And Beg blew himself up outside of a NATO outpost in Paktia province on March 3rd, 2009, killing 2 NATO soldiers, 2 Afghan soldiers, and injuring 19. In his documented tape, Haqqani, the leader of the Haqqani network, mentioned that if Beg could have found his way back out through Turkey, he certainly would have been on and aboard Western aircraft if they could have found a way to make that happen, but instead had nobly martyred himself to take out other Westerners that were located in Afghanistan. And I mention this because playing to win in the longer term is really making sure that the insurgents who would like to establish wider safe haven in Afghanistan don't get that as a result of their erstwhile and continuing, unfortunately, success in Western Pakistan in expanding safe haven. There is a serious need to do more work across the border with and through the Pakistani government and the Pakistani military, who, for their own reasons, continue to see the Western Frontier province and indeed continue to see the wider processes of jihadism as something that does not require a collaborative and a very physical type of approach. And that, in and of itself, is a problem for the West. But make no mistake about it. If the problem is over in Western Pakistan right now, we will quickly come across the border into Afghanistan because of all the cultural affinity, the historical proclivity, and the erstwhile desire by those who lead al-Qaeda and the other extremist movements to find a comfortable location from which to plan, train, and develop operatives who would make Air Canada strikes and other major strikes against Western targets their primary mission. And so in the long term, I think, even though one could argue that the long term would require a lot less of a footprint, indeed a drawdown maybe much like has occurred in the Balkans could occur once you get beyond the worst of the problems there, it is that long-term mission and that long-term desire on the part of NATO to see this as the threat that it truly is. Still extant, still across the border, but still requiring us to work with the government that will have us right now, the Afghan government, even as we work with the government right now that's kind of ambivalent with us, the Pakistani government. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. Very, very valuable contributions to the discussion. And what struck me in terms of the commonality of the three presentations, even though you've all come at it from a very different perspective, but the whole idea of sustainability and the importance of that, but also the question of it in terms of the politics and various other things. I think we're going to hear a little bit more about that from the NATO perspective by Dr. Berry of the National Defense University. So with that, Dr. Berry, please over to you.
Thanks, Eric, and I will pick up on what Tom just mentioned. I think it's very crucial to take a step back and realize how important it is to come away from this experience in Afghanistan in a positive sense, both in terms of what happens in quelling the concerns we have about the terrorists that were just mentioned, but also in preserving NATO. Neither of those issues resonate very well with our publics on a day-to-day basis, and as we find ourselves getting into what will soon be the longest war we've ever been in, it's very difficult to sustain the public support. And so I think this is one of the crucial issues that we face in achieving this success, and I say that somewhat ambivalently because we don't really know what it is. We haven't well defined what success will be there. We have very laudatory goals of democracy in Afghanistan and having a lot of the cultural facts on the ground that we see there migrate more toward Western values. Young girls going to school and things of this nature, and some of this may be more lofty than we can really tolerate in the long run. So I would think that one of the things that we want to do as we try and define success is to take a good, cold, hard look at what might be achievable here in the time period that we can bring our publics to bear. One of the things that's obvious is that we do not have a lot of military support from our European allies or financial support. Yet in all, the European Union has 500 million people, quite a bit more than the United States and Canada. And they also have a GDP that is in the aggregate at least as large as ours, somewhere in the vicinity of $13 trillion. So they have the wherewithal, but they're not there. Our allies are not there with us. And if you look at the mission statements of ISAF and OEF, the Operation Enduring Freedom, there's wiggle room there for interpretation on a national basis as to what we mean by conduct military operations to provide a safe and secure environment for the government of Afghanistan to conduct its governance process. So those military operations can be anything. In most of what NATO does with its forces comes out to support the PRTs, the Provisional Reconstruction Teams, and do the development work. There is some very useful work there, and NATO has some put in place very useful programs. For example, the mentoring and liaison teams, which go out not only to the higher level headquarters, but down to the battalion level. And these and the rules of the game there are that the liaison teams have to be in country for 6 months. So these programs are useful from that side, but where we lack is on the security side, where the Canadians and the Americans and our Dutch allies are conducting counterinsurgency operations. So how do you get that message across? And we've, of course, even seen difficulties. We wonder a little bit sometimes about our European allies' inability to connect with their people when you see what the Irish, some of the Irish who voted down the Lisbon Treaty were saying, well, I'm voting this down because it doesn't include direct flights to London and things like this. There doesn't seem to be a good concerted effort on the part of the bureaucrats in Brussels to reach the people and get the public support. We've heard the term democratic deficit used in the European Union before with the rejection of the Constitution some years ago in France and the Netherlands. So one of the issues is to connect with our publics, much as Pamela has indicated that has been done in Canada, needs to be done around the alliance so that we can get that support and help them understand. Now, some would argue that, well, NATO is passé, it was a Cold War entity and it was useful in its day, but, we can go on the sidelines. I would argue that if you look back at its track records in the 1990s and in this current decade, we see a lot of very, very useful programs we do not want to easily set aside, things like the Partnership for Peace program that stabilized and brought in a lot of Eastern European militaries to not only conduct operations like Western militaries such that they might be able to work with us if they wish, but in addition to that, to have things like military justice for their troops and to add civilian control of the military. So there's very useful things that NATO has done, and we don't want to easily throw this alliance away. We have committed the alliance in Afghanistan. So we now have to succeed in Afghanistan to some extent. So this is a big issue, I think, for NATO, and it was not dealt with particularly well at the Bucharest summit with the strategic vision for Afghanistan, for ISAF's strategic vision, because it doesn't mention at all in there anything about fighting. It talks about the development operations, the use of military forces to assist the Afghan National Army, the Afghan National Police, and there's some good programs there that are very nascent and therefore have not produced results. And the GAO report that came out this past week indicated that we're just scratching the surface, particularly with the National Police. And in that effort, again, we see that the European Union is talking about signing up to, I guess, almost 300 police trainers, whereas the U.S. has some 7,000 military and police trainers in country now. So there's a lot more that we could hope to do, but the first thing is to reconcile the different national determinations of what the mission is and how to go about it. I talked to some of my European colleagues this past week, and there's in some cases it's public attitudes toward America as a result of the Iraq war. There's certainly some of that, and we have to recognize that and deal with that. There's some other attitudes that, well, you're just going about this the wrong way. It's development. What we know is that it's both development and security. So there has to be a dealing with the security piece. The recent attacks in Kandahar could be argued that there's a big problem in getting to the sanctuaries. We know from our own studies of counterinsurgency. I'm a former military officer who's of the Vietnam era and spent my time, as they say, in the Brotherhood of Close Combat in that war, and we learned that you have to get rid of sanctuaries. You can't have an over-the-border sanctuary that feeds and protects the insurgent force. And of course, we have the situation in Afghanistan, not only over the border in Pakistan, but also inside the country. And how do you get to that? Well, we need fewer national caveats, obviously. We got over national caveats for the most part in Kosovo, so we know that NATO can do this. It took a lot of effort and a lot of pressure. There was a much more concerted common strategy in the previous operation in the Balkans and in Bosnia, so we know NATO can arrive at a common military strategy. But we need to work on this. We need to get away from a NATO A and a NATO B, particularly where the NATO A is much smaller. So I think one of those issues is to address that, and we don't know how this will come about, but we do have some hope on the horizon. After all, it does appear with a very tentative inking that we are improving things in Iraq to the extent that maybe the U.S. can turn more of its forces, as Tom has indicated, to Afghanistan. The chairman was out at Fort Lewis this week and told the troops out there, unfortunately, don't expect the the dwell time or the time in the States between tours to be any longer than 12 months for the indefinite future, because we're going to have to push what we can that comes back from Iraq to Afghanistan. And he also mentioned that the stop-loss policy will not go away. So we know that the U.S. is posturing itself, or at least getting ready, particularly as it increases over the next few years its Army and Marine Corps, to try and do more in Afghanistan, and it needs its allies to step up as well. General Petraeus is coming to CENTCOM. He's been successful in Iraq, definitely should be given a lot of credit for that, and we would hope that now that he's overseeing Afghanistan as well as Iraq, that's a positive sign in how to make the counterinsurgency operations more effective. This operation recently in Kandahar showed that there's some capabilities already in the Afghan National Army, and we want to see that pursued. What will be the next administration's approach to Afghanistan? What will be, when the new administration comes in January of 2009, less than 3 months later, will be in Strasbourg, France, at a NATO summit. Too early to really have a new agenda there for a new administration, we would expect. But what will be the top items there? Will it be missile defense in Europe? Will it be a new strategic concept, or will we be doing what we've been talking about here today, and that is focusing in on getting a new approach to Afghanistan, what the NATO summit in Bucharest called, or Riga and Bucharest has called, a comprehensive approach, working more closely together with the UN. That's been inked by the new resolution of the UN, 1806, that calls for closer ties to ISAF, NATO ISAF forces. You have a new civilian NATO representative coming in next month into Kabul to work with the new UN Secretary General's representative, Qaeda. So, and he has experience working with NATO in the Balkans. So, there is some positive signs here that we have the right leadership coming in. We have an opportunity with the new U.S. government coming in. So maybe there is something that can be done here. In any case, what has to happen, and Pamela indicated, there's no victory here. When NATO first went in to Afghanistan, my first thought sitting back was, my goodness, how does NATO return to Brussels for a ticker tape parade out of Afghanistan? And that's an overstatement. It's not the parade that's important. What's important is we have NATO back, having been strengthened by its experience, its allies able to do something far outside of the NATO area, maybe too far outside. We'll have to see how that goes. But we do need to figure out a way to deal with other partners, and that includes figuring out. We know Karzai is a Pashtun, maybe, and the Taliban are Pashtun. Maybe there's a seam there that can be pursued, but the U.S. should be looking at how to bring in the insurgents as opposed to trying to defeat them. That's been critical in past insurgencies, counterinsurgencies, the success of past counterinsurgencies, and I think it's going to be crucial here. Afghanistan's neighbors. We talked a little bit about bringing in Pakistan, but we also may need to bring in Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Iran, and think about those countries, because if we're going to draw our forces down to a less visible level, and that's important to get away from the occupation syndrome throughout the occupiers that causes public support for the Taliban, then we need to deal with a regional approach. We need to have the ability to come in and out of there, maybe in the future as advisors, maybe exercises, something low level. And of course, because there are insurgents and there are those who are irreconcilable, we're going to have perhaps some special operations forces. I want to just turn to a couple of other things that are useful to know about NATO with respect to Afghanistan. I was at the giving a talk at the Netherlands Embassy a couple of weeks ago to the senior staff college over from The Hague, and I just asked for a show of hands of how many officers had been deployed to Afghanistan, and almost every officer raised his hand. So I said, well, how many have been deployed twice or more? And three-quarters of them raised their hand. We are building a large reservoir of very experienced officers across NATO. Look at the heads of the various regions in Afghanistan, the different countries they're from, and those who've been in command in the Balkans also, Spain, Italy, the Netherlands, of course, and you see that a lot of officers from a very early age now, if you go back to the first time NATO went into the Balkans since 1995, you've got about 13 years of NATO deployments. Not only U.S. experience, but across NATO. And this is a very useful reservoir, not just in the combat experience of it, but in the peace operations experience of it, which may be even more important, and the experience of working together. Which leads me to the next point, and that's interoperability. The U.S. has this policy of sharing information, particularly classified information, on the Five Eyes concept, those 5 countries who have special relationships with the U.S. in a military sense, and that's the U.K. and Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, and of course the U.S. So, but other countries, the Netherlands and Denmark, particularly those countries that are down there in combat operations, need to be able to get on the radio, have an aircraft call, and get critical information like location of troops and so forth, and that's not happening yet. So we need to do that. But NATO has this immersion in working together, and that is building interoperability, which is very important. It's at least showing us where the seams are. There are combat systems that we need if we're going to do this, because not only the 52,000, almost 53,000 troops that NATO has in Afghanistan now not enough, but to cover the what the military calls the white space, those areas where they're not, they need to have systems such as unmanned air vehicles, unmanned combat air vehicles, drones, things of this nature. They need ground sensors, they need space-based systems to be able to know where the enemy is so they can take the forces they have and move there quickly using the helicopters that Tom mentioned. And helicopters, partial to that since I spent my career largely as a helicopter pilot, but I would say that, I mean, that's the way you get around when there's no roads and when you need to get there quickly to respond and to keep the enemy on his heels. When we can do this, then you don't see the massing of forces as we saw recently near Kandahar, which they do when they think they can win. When they can't do that, they disperse. So these are high payout systems. As well are the police trainers that we're training, or the Army and police trainers that we're training out, or that cadre of forces that we're building out at Fort Riley, Kansas. Standing up the local forces is the way out of the box. This is what we have achieved in the past. We've tried to achieve in the past, not always successfully, but we did that largely in Bosnia. It's not so much there yet in Kosovo, but it's what we're doing in Iraq, and it's what we were going to try and do. We are trying to do here, and we have to stand this force up. It's going to take a long time, and then we consider that we will revert to support functions: logistics, command and control, intelligence, transportation, and maintenance will be ours for a long time to come. Somehow or other, we have to look at what our people are really interested in coming out of Afghanistan, and one of them that is now on the table that wasn't before is opium. That's not a NATO mission yet, but we have to realize that if we pull out of Afghanistan and it becomes remains a reservoir of over 90% of the world's opium, we haven't really. There's a huge problem, and you can readily see how this would resonate with our people. If all you have to do is look at the billions of dollars we spend trying to stem the flow of cocaine out of Central America and Latin America, and realize that there's now more cultivation in Afghanistan than there is in Central America in terms of poppy. So we have to try and work on that piece. There should be no expectation, perhaps, that the Karzai government or the central government of Afghanistan need be fully extended in the entire country. Exactly the level of centrality versus local autonomy is an area, too, where I think we may take some measure of effectiveness there and say where is good enough as opposed to perfection, because the country has never had either that experience politically or the infrastructure to support it. Roads, telecommunications, transportation, although there's a big effort now recently, I guess over the next few years, they're going to build 12 local airports, some of which are capable of handling 737s, 727s, and aircraft of the like. So we have to look at what we can expect in terms of getting the central government out, and that will lead us to ultimately some idea of the ability of the central government to sustain itself as we pull further and further back. I think I'll leave it there. We're going to have some time for questions.
Well, thank you very much, and that was just a really fine way to conclude the formal presentations. You all have been very patient from the audience perspective, and we want to thank you for coming and taking so much time. We've got a little bit of time for questions and answers. So much information and ideas and thoughts are already on the table, and it'd be interesting to see where this conversation goes, because there's just so much out there. So why don't we do this? If we could have you, after I call on you, identify yourself by name and organization. Is there a circulating mic? There is. We'll start in the back there, and if your question is directed to a specific panelist, please identify them, or if it's general, just let us know that as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. My name is Mando Khail from Voice of America, Afghan Service. And my question is referred to Mr. Thomas Lynch. President Hamid Karzai, a few days ago, he threatened that he will send forces into Pakistan to target the insurgents, the Taliban militia leaders there. At the same time, President Bush, he said he knows President Karzai's concerns, but now Secretary Rice, she said that the Karzai's threat, what Karzai's threat to pressure militias into Pakistani territory, it was not wise. My question is that is these comments are not contrary to President Bush's comments, and in the same time reports indicate that some U.S. officials they have said that they have records or they have information about some Pakistani soldiers and some Pakistani officials that they have helped in attacking in Afghanistan.
Tom, what about cross-border actions, Pakistan and Afghanistan?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I mean, you've put your finger on, and obviously with a great deal of understanding, that you put your finger on the some would argue, and I think I would agree, the most significant issue here for the security situation. And I think what we have to understand is President Karzai's frustration, obviously spilled over into his comments. Comments that highlight the fact that his government is, in fact, in many places along the eastern border, doing an awful lot in terms of extending good governance, having an expanded, and I might add here, a very well-respected and capable Afghan National Army presence, which by all polling and other indicators suggest is well respected by most, if not all, Afghans when it comes and is in an area to try to provide stability and security. Would it were that we could get the Afghan National Police and local police up to the same standards, but knock wood, that's coming. But there's an awful lot of frustration there. And because of the fact, as you obviously well know, there is really no distinction between Pashtuns that live on one side of the border or the other, or for those of you that are familiar with the Durand Line, as it's referred to, due to the compromise map drawn by then British High Viceroy and Representative to Pakistan back in the early 1900s as the demarcation. There is no clear distinction there. It's very hard to delineate that. So whether an attack's occurring on one side of the line or the other, whether it originated in Pakistan or the other, it's very amorphous. One thing I think we can say, though, fairly clearly, in defense of President Karzai's position, even as I might add, President Bush, Secretary Rice, Secretary Gates, and others have to find a way to work cooperatively and collaboratively with a Pakistani government that we may have some frustrations with, but is dealing with its own unique set of circumstances in the western frontier provinces, not dealing with it in ways that we might like right now, and perhaps arguably we need to take a somewhat different tact or a harder approach in some areas, but that too I think is coming. But I understand President Karzai's frustrations. These are frustrations I saw him expressing in private way back in 2004 in meetings with senior officials and leaders, and they are not without some merit. But what I think you have to understand here is, even though there may be exchanges, counter-exchanges, representative commentary, the point is Afghanistan still has a ways to go to establish the trappings of good governance and to be able to unambiguously say, no, that attack did not emanate from within our territory. While at the same time, the Pakistanis have a long way to go to really exercise true control, sovereignty, and responsible oversight of their military in its many different manifestations in the western provinces, so it can authoritatively say, no, those attacks aren't coming from our areas. And we got a ways to go there right now, and while frustrations are going to spill over and comments are going to occur, we also need to continue to work behind the scenes to find a better way to partner and to do trilateral cooperation, collaboration to end those who would secure their political objectives by violence and wanton destruction.
Thank you. Other questions? I think there's one right here, and then we'll go to the back there, and then right here, and that'll probably be what we can do for the time we have. So 1, 2 in the back, and 3 here to the left.
Max Kelly from the Henry L. Stimson Center. Great talks, and I have about 5 questions, which I will not ask all of for obvious reasons. So I'll narrow it down to 2. One has to do with the sort of the regional strategic outlook. Ahmed Rashid gave a talk not too long ago, last week or the week before at CSIS, and mentioned or suggested that, in fact, Pakistan and India were both prepared for a face-saving solution in Kashmir. Given that much of the, or at least the origins of Pakistani strategy in support of the Taliban, in support of a relatively unstable extremist Afghanistan, has been in relation to both the Kashmir border dispute and the concept of strategic depth in case of a conflict with India, is perhaps the indirect route to stability in Afghanistan. Does it go along the India-Pakistan border, and is that where the international community should focus some of its diplomatic efforts? The second, briefer question has to do with this issue of the degree of centralization in the government. There are 2 articles in the latest issue of International Security, one by Seth Jones, the other by Thomas Johnson out at the Naval Postgraduate School. Jones argues that the fundamental problem in the current counterinsurgency effort in Afghanistan has to do with a lack of good governance, so a lack of services, etc., extended into especially rural areas. Johnson and his co-author, whose name I've forgotten, argues sort of conversely that it's a cultural problem, that it's essentially a Pashtun problem, and that rather than trying to extend government centrality or government services, even essential services, the correct strategy is to try and essentially strike tribal deals and not try and extend that control. And even in the talk today, there seem to be sort of tensions between, on the one hand, the idea of establishing real Afghan sovereignty, including essential services, and on the other, a recognition of the difficult cultural and historical barriers to doing so. So I'm wondering if maybe you can address those tensions that have even come up in among the speakers today. Thank you.
Thank you for those questions. Who wants to? Let's Pamela first.
Well, just a couple of just quick points on the governance issue, and at the end, I mean, the problem is, and here's the dilemma: they have to have some kind of governance structure in order to know whether that's what they don't want or want. You know, you have to have government to be able to criticize government, and it's so they're still working through those very basic things. Of course, you're not going to have a real command and control at the center because the president is he lacks the support that is needed for that. There are great concerns about the levels of corruption and how that spreads out. So I think that is a huge issue. But on the other hand, what we saw, and you would know better than I, Thomas, the way the tribal councils were emerging in the local areas was in fact not instead of, but parallel to. I mean, it's just a more efficient delivery system, and it's very different than what outsiders might plan. But it was also very reflective. I mean, we met with the governor in Bamiyan province, and here's a woman. A, she's the governor. B, just really getting her hands dirty. I mean, this was 24/7. She works. She's at the hospital. She's at up at the mountainside. They're trying to reconstruct the Buddhas that the Taliban took down. There's very, very different forms. And we again have to figure out that we can't just impose our structures. There was one not amusing but sort of amusing story about trying to figure out how we were going to pay the military or the police as opposed to the military. The military has some structure, and there was a way to pay that, and the ISAF forces, the NATO forces, had decided that the answer would be, and I'm paraphrasing a very long story, but that they would just simply make sure that the money was deposited in the accounts of the police officers, and they would be able to withdraw it at will and from the ATM, and then they wouldn't be subject to all the bribery and whatnot on the street corners. Well, small problem, of course, as we know, no banks, no ATMs, and no financial literacy. So what seemed like a really good idea then was, replaced with, let's get some fingerprints and some pictures, and if they match, let's give them money, because we have to do that. But the families are wiser than we are, a lot of them. They've got some kids, working for our side. They've got some kids working for the Taliban, and maybe they've got one working for a drug lord, because they've got to wait and see how this one plays out and whether we're committed.
Charles Berry?
Well, I think both the articles that you cited are correct. I mean, the insurgents are fed by bad government, by corruption. You can't forget that the Taliban came to power because they wanted to throw out the warlords who were so corrupt. So that's one key thing. So, and as long as Karzai cannot come up with some sort of a level of acceptable governance. I'm not saying get rid of all corruption. Most people, and maybe even in Washington, would have difficulty with that. But the thing is that he has to come up with some level that's acceptable to the people that says, okay, we're no longer going to fight to get rid of you because your corruption is at some level. And then at the same time, realizing that the particular religious tenets that the Taliban are holding to is a splinter from the Pashtun, right? So that they, and that might be even an internal issue for the Pashtun culture, but also certainly they want to take over the country like they did before. And that doesn't sit well with the non-Pashtun peoples, the other cultures. So if Karzai can address those other cultures in the larger Pashtun population, then the Taliban who wish to, reinsert their laws and as they had before, this would be, the people would support Karzai. We've seen some indications of that, even as he talked about, was mentioned before, going into Pakistan. And, that makes sense.
Hey, Max, I'd be happy to talk with you offline, but just real quickly, I think Ahmad is exactly right. Jihadism is a cross-Pakistan issue. You can't separate the two, okay? And once Pakistan gets serious about standing down in Kashmir, then that takes a lot of steam out of the jihadi engine. And second, well, I think Tom Johnson's points are correct about the Pashtun nature. I think he's wide of the mark. I think Seth is right. If you don't establish credible governance out of Kabul, you don't resolve the issue. And better tribalism is not the antidote to how al-Qaeda wishes to operate. And that's even a more powerful critique of the anthropological approach to just doing better tribalism.
Good stuff. Question in the back, please.
Yes, hello. My name is Erica Triscari. I'm a strategic planner with the Army Directed Studies Office, or OPCON to the G3. My question is to the Canadian contingent, and actually I have a question and observation for Dr. Berry. The question is, Mr. Sokolsky, you had indicated that in 2005 Canada was justifying its commitments to Afghanistan by using the policy of the failed state, that the failed state is in fact a security risk to Canada. And I would agree with that. However, how is Canada going to address issues of, say, Kosovo independence digressing into conflict rather than being the frozen conflict that it is, into a military conflict? And what would that do for your commitments in Afghanistan? And that also comes into my comment. Dr. Berry, you had mentioned that the EU is ambivalent towards Afghanistan, and I would also agree with you. I work with the Europeans often, and I worked on PFP. But their ambivalence is not due to how it has been portrayed, objections to Bush foreign policy, but rather two things. One, they have nation states declaring independence in their backyard. They have Abkhazia and the Caucasus. They have Kosovo, Nagorno-Karabakh, and the Transnistria question, all of which could flare into armed conflict and have been directing a lot of their resources towards that. Additionally, many of the European countries remember in 1979, those countries that fell under the former Soviet states, remember already fighting in Afghanistan and remember their people coming back in body bags. And some of them have expressed to me that trying to sell Afghanistan to the European nations is tantamount to selling another Vietnam to the Americas. It doesn't go over very well. So I'm sure you've probably come across that issue, but some other folks don't think about that when they're addressing the EU and Afghanistan. So I just wanted to pose that question, that observation. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Sokolsky, please.
Well, in fact, I mean, Afghanistan is it for the Canadian military at the moment. The ability to do anything else, if Kosovo, we need to go back into Kosovo, it simply isn't there because the Army is barely 20,000. The burden of all these operations falls on the Army, and with rotation now, it's becoming difficult. We are building up a cadre of officers and men who have served, but that's also part of the problem because it becomes difficult. And one of the worries is, in fact, that the IPS statement that failed and fragile states are a threat to Canadian security is not backed up by the type of spending that would make that possible unless you do something with the Navy, because the Navy is also looking to recapitalize, and the Air Force is looking down for a new fighter, and defense spending increases, although dramatic, may not be able to sustain that. So yes, I think that's going to be a problem, and it just reinforces a point I tried to get across earlier, that the narrative of Canada being a laggard in the 1990s was true only so far as defense spending was not true insofar as our commitment to NATO. where we were putting, including in Kosovo, people at risk. And whether you'll be able to sustain public support for a policy which says there's a failed and fragile state, it could harbor terrorists, they could strike at Canada. The other argument is, well, if you have homegrown terrorists, whether in Europe or in Canada, maybe your emphasis should be on homeland security as well. That's a real Canada first defense policy. But yes, I think I don't see any major increases in defense spending that are going to be able to sustain us repeating this, although I'm happy to see defense spending, but even maintaining the operation in Afghanistan. We as what we call ourselves at the Royal Military College, the Chairborne Division, we're having officers and instructors being pulled out now. Now, part of this is because General Hillier also used the occasion to transform the Canadian military, and he set up a lot of these new commands. And a recent Senate report has indicated that that's drawing officers as well. So it's not clear whether there I think, in fact, there is going to be another relook at the IPS in terms of linking it in failed and fragile states. From the military standpoint, you can certainly, in terms of development and assistance, that's something which the Canadian public would support, and they would support traditional peacekeeping. It appears as the polls indicate. But whether the military could sustain the intensity of this deployment again, even if it were in Kosovo, I think would go back. I mean, also respond to the other question. If you say to the public, we're not there to impose our values, but we're telling that government what to do. I mean, if we're not, part of Canadians believe is we do export our values. And I guess the concern would be if it turns out that NATO is willing to accept trade stability for democracy in these areas, which is maybe what we need, then it becomes difficult to support this sort of policy. So as unrealistic as it is, tales of corruption in Afghanistan and in the government and they resonate within the public, which is being told that we're there not to impose our values, but certainly to promote things that are important to us at the risk of the lives of our soldiers.
But I do think it highlights the fissure, the split that is in NATO. What you see on the ground in Afghanistan, I mean, it's not just a two-tier alliance in the sense that there are those that will fight and those that won't fight. That's one issue. But the thinking of the European contingent is much more focused on the Balkans and other areas than we are. And so that's where you get that ambivalence and that unwillingness to step up. I mean, certainly Sarkozy was kind of a one-off in the sense of his agreement to do that, which really in the end only freed up Americans to move into the trouble spot. But that was the only response we got. So I think that, that has to be, we have to look at that, of who's in charge of what spot, and let them respond according to areas of interest. Don't know what else you can do, but call it.
But in the 1990s, Europe said it would take care of the Balkans, and it took out American leadership and Canadian commitment to take care of it.
In the interest of time, let's move to the last question here, please, because we are up right against our deadline, and as I say, you all have been very good to spend so much time with us this morning.
Tristan Landry, I'm the spokesperson at the Canadian Embassy, and this will not reflect Canadian position or Government of Canada position. This is my honest, as an observer. 2 weeks ago, we did a bit of outreach with our Canadian ambassador in Kabul here in the U.S. We did a few interviews, and we did one at the Washington Journal on C-SPAN in the morning, which is a call-in show. And we were both a bit stunned by the topic of the questions that we got. It was all focused on the opium trade. Mm-hmm. And Pamela and Joel gave a good overview about how much effort has been done in Canada in terms of explaining the Afghanistan conflict to the Canadian population. Obviously, we need to do more. But I'm wondering about the fact that Iraq has taken so much of kind of the attention in the U.S., and now that we're shifting to Afghanistan, or the U.S. seems to be shifting to Afghanistan, are we not going to be facing kind of a similar situation in the U.S. in terms of trying to explain the Afghanistan mission to the Americans? So I guess my question is probably to the two U.S. panelists.
I think that's a terrific question. What I'd like to do is I'd like to have all the panelists respond briefly to it. And in the course of your response, if there's one final thing you want to get into the conversation, I did the same program myself several weeks ago on NAFTA, and let me tell you that there are some strange people out there asking some interesting questions. That's right. So don't take that necessarily as a cross-section of the United States, or maybe you should. I don't know. But the point is that it's a very good question. Let's start all the way to the far side and work down, and we'll give Pamela the last word.
Well, I think you're right. We'd have to explain why we're in Afghanistan. One of the things that I ponder sometimes, and it was in the online press within the last couple of weeks, and I don't know what the source is at the top of my head, but that President Bush was urging the Special Operations Forces and so forth to get bin Laden before he leaves office. And we have the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff saying Friday the leadership of al-Qaeda is clearly in the federally administrated tribal areas. So I'm thinking, what if we got bin Laden? What if bin Laden were arrested or killed? What would be the American support to be in Afghanistan after that? Okay? How many Americans is Afghanistan worth? So that would be one issue. I think in the same vein, and there's not enough time here to talk about all the reasons why Americans would be for it against, or Europeans would be for or against being in Afghanistan, but there's a lot of distractions out there. Our own economies, Europe is trying to figure out how closely they are together, and they are more interested naturally in the Balkans than they are in Afghanistan. This is understandable, totally understandable. But at the same time, we have NATO out there, and I would worry if we didn't have NATO. I would worry how we would get ourselves to work together. NATO is not just an alliance that we would use, but it's where our militaries work together, train together, plan together, so that if they decide to go somewhere else, as so-called coalitions of the willing, they are familiar with each other. We lose less troops that way. We get out quicker. So we need some sort of organization like that, and we've invested our nation's treasures for too many decades to just quickly throw away what we already have. So I think we should stick to that. I'd just like to one last point, and that is that when we talk about what the Europeans are doing, you take Spain, they have 770 troops in Afghanistan, less than a third of what Canada does, but they got half again as many people. The per capita capability to contribute more is clearly there, and they're not doing that. Spain, Germany, France, Italy, and Poland all have what you might call an underrepresentation of what they could provide just in terms of being out there. Okay, whereas you find a country like Denmark who takes the top lead in terms of casualties. On a per capita basis, if you take a look at the 16 Danish casualties, that would be 830 people if that was the United States. And our casualties are about 550. In Canada. Canada is huge. But a lot of countries in the Netherlands. The Netherlands has, on a per capita basis, equivalent to 32,000 troops if they were the United States, roughly what we have. So these countries are doing their share, but the bigger countries are not. And I think they have the wherewithal, but they've spent 15 years under 2%. At a constant under 2%. It's unprecedented to have that low a defense spending. Why do they do that? Because they can. Because the Americans are out securing the world, much like we did when the British were in charge of the world in the 19th century. So it makes sense. I understand it. But the point is that we need to urge them to do more. And the way we do that is get them interested in the mission in Afghanistan.
Tom, quick comment.
Yeah, I think the premise of your question is important. It's been said for over 5 years now, but this has been kind of the forgotten war for our publics. And so even as we're trying to educate, and it's a necessary education, of basic facts like, first, that, the U.S. has about 39,000 troops in total in Afghanistan, but NATO does have 24,000, Okay, while there's some issues and we have legitimate debates about how to use them best and whether or not we can sustain them, they still are there, and that's an important point. Otherwise, you get lost in the demagoguery about who's doing what and who's not doing what. Second, there's an awful lot of relearning about what's actually gone on in the last 4 to 5 years in Afghanistan. I see a lot of stuff written right now by people who are well-intentioned, but I think underinformed about how we just need to talk better to the Pashtuns, and there's a real issue there. And if we could just get Karzai, and with all due deference to those on the panel, hey, Karzai has been talking to disaffected Taliban and has been bringing over mid to high-level leaders for the last 5 years to absolutely no effect to Taliban behaviors and patterns because they have safe haven and they have reconstitution across the border. So some of these things have to be re-educated, but it's about time. And so 2 points I'd leave with that re-education process. First, the linkage to the wider global terrorism issue. As I tried to highlight, perhaps poorly, with the Air Canada examples, and I could go on here by looking at the big examples of foiled terrorist attacks over the last couple of years. Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, as an assistant, are looking to bring in Western, second and third generation Muslims, vet them, train them in sanctuary, and then return them to strike overseas. That is as big a threat as you get, friends, in the post-Cold War era, I would argue. And that is where I think the Canadian report did a good job of trying to at least refocus and make sure we haven't lost the bubble on that. And the only way to do this is to not lose Afghanistan and make sure we're doing better in Pakistan going forward. And second is to understand we need partners in this process. For all the challenges we may have with our NATO allies and trying to get them to do better, it really is a challenge that's an important one to take on in terms of better management, not cutting the cord, ripping up the pieces of paper and saying we don't want to be with you, old Europe, new Europe, or whatever those distinctions would be. We need the partnership here. And by the way, we've had some example with this, because if you look back at the development of strategy in the Balkans, you'd see hair pulling, hand wringing, consternation. How are we going to do this? We don't agree. But somehow, some way, we found out, perhaps by accident, that hanging together is better than hanging separately. And that is, I think, where we are in this wider process in Afghanistan right now, put in the proper perspective of the global pursuit of terrorism who would strike against us.
Thank you.
Well, I don't know if I think there was a poll recently that when asked what was the greatest moment in Canadian foreign policy activity in the last few years, more Canadians said not going to Iraq than going to Afghanistan. And as much as I regret it, and I think also there is a large body of opinion in Canada which is still uneasy over all this global war on terrorism. I don't know why, but if you read people like Michael Byers, it resonates. And any Canadian government has to take that into account, believing that realism in foreign policy begins at home. So it will be difficult. The good news for Canada may be that the United States will become more focused on Afghanistan after Iraq, but the bad news may be that the United States will become focused on Afghanistan after Iraq, and it will become, you won't be able to get out, that it will look to allies justifiably to contribute, and that'll put pressure on a Canadian government and a public which may want to do other things in the world more under UN, perhaps under a more clear UN mandate. The problem for the Canadian government, unfortunately, in Afghanistan has been, in a sense, precisely this link to the global war on terrorism. On the one hand, you want to sell this to Canadians. It is important. It is a threat. On the other hand, Canadians are treated daily to the Maharars, to Guantanamo Bay, and all this, and it's a difficult position for the government of Canada to sell this, even though I personally believe it's important to be there, but it places the government of Canada in a difficult position, particularly as the casualties mount, and particularly as other NATO allies don't appear to be as forthcoming. So I wouldn't underestimate that. Canadians, I think, are looking forward to regime change in Washington, but it's not clear that with either party in power, if an emphasis is on Afghanistan, it may be more difficult for the Canadian government to hold to the 2011 decision, because then you'll say, well, here, we're not Bush, we're the unilateralism with the smile people, we're going to consult with your allies, but consultation usually means at the end of the day putting boots on the ground somewhere. That's a difficulty for this government, and perhaps for the military, which has been particularly stretched. I mean, you mentioned the Olympics are going to draw a large part of Canadian security apparatus to secure them, and that's Homeland Security. So, yes, I think if Afghanistan continues, it will be it will make it difficult for Canada to go elsewhere, and will put a strain on any Canadian government of whichever party may be in power.
Very good. Pamela, last word.
Well, I think we're seeing through this whole debate and these last points that an issue that we're still wrestling with in Canada, but which all of our allies wrestle with, which is this latent anti-Americanism, this love-hate relationship. We want them to include us and ask us and let us have a part and be nice and make us part of the coalition, but if we don't have the equipment or the toys or the desire or the willingness, then we want them to go and fix it. So we send some very difficult messages to the Americans who I think post 9/11 have whose worldview has changed and who have felt much under attack in a much realer way than I think many, many people were able to grasp and understand, including in our own country. So, yes, Afghanistan will be the good war, whether it's McCain or Obama, and Iraq will be the bad war, and so more resources will go in, and I think there's all of those things. In the short term, that will be good, and in the long term, it will give more fodder for that anti-American sentiment that is so prevalent everywhere. And it's just, I think, part of the discussion about NATO, part of the discussion about the United Nations, part of the discussion about war fighting versus peacekeeping, I hope will get us to a slightly more realistic approach to what we are all dealing with in the world. And it is better to play together than play alone, which is why it's so important to work out the kinks. Say it out loud. You can't fix it if you don't name it.
Well, and that is a good way to end. David, I know we're well beyond time, but I wanted to let the conversation continue on because I thought it was so rich and informative, and I thought very, very interesting as well. So I'm going to turn it back over to you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for your time and your interest.
And without keeping you any longer, thank you very much for your patience, for your contributions, and thanks to a wonderful panel. Have a good day.